Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending Session 8 of the IBR Webinar series. As a reminder to all participants, this webinar is public and is being recorded. The registration information was posted on the NERC website and widely distributed. Speakers on the call should keep in mind that the listening audience may include members of the press and representatives of various governmental authorities, in addition to the expected participation by industry stakeholders. Should you wish to ask a question during today's webinar, please use the Q&A feature. It is NERC's policy and practice to obey the antitrust laws and to avoid all conduct that unreasonably restrains competition. This policy requires the avoidance of any conduct that violates or that might appear to violate the antitrust laws. Any NERC participant that is uncertain about the legal ramification of a particular course of conduct, or who has doubts or concerns about whether or not NERC's antitrust compliance policy is implicated in any situation, should consult NERC's General Counsel immediately. At this time, we will hear a few words from Alex Shatta.
Thanks, Tiffany. Welcome, everyone, to Session 8 of our Inverter-Based Resource webinar series. Today we're going to talk about the interconnection process. We have three good speakers from throughout the industry to give us their perspective and insights from their region. So while we talk today, please use the Q&A to submit some questions, and we'll get to those answers either through the Q&A. And if we don't get to them today, either from text answer or from the panel, we're going to be sending out kind of a FAQ/themes, answering those questions when the rest of the meeting materials get posted after the webinar series. So in addition to that, we're going to take next week off because of the 4th of July holiday, and we'll join up for a 3-webinar week the following week. So that's the 11th, 12th, and 13th will be the final 3 webinars just crammed in a row the week after the holiday week. So just keep that in mind. Don't try to join next week. We won't be having it, but we'll come back after the holiday week. So with all that being said, we're going to kick it off, or Allison's going to kick it off for us. So go ahead, Allison.
Thank you, Alex. So my name is Allison Aldhill. I'm the Principal Manager of Transmission System Analysis here at Southern California Edison. So today I'm excited to have the opportunity to share a little bit about our interconnection process, some of the trends that we've been seeing lately, as well as some of the broader initiatives going on here in the state of California that have largely been triggered by resource needs, largely IBRs due to our clean energy goals, as well as our interconnection process itself and some of the pain points that we have experienced there. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to give, I know everyone does things a little differently, very quick overview of what our interconnection process looks like. So typically it's about 5 stages from an application or interconnection request submittal to an actual in-service. So the first of those is application processing. So engineers going through a checklist, making sure application meets the required criteria. Once that is deemed complete, then it moves into a technical scoping meeting. So that technical scoping meeting is to look at what is previously studied and known about the area. So that's an opportunity for the customer to work and discuss with both, in our case, Southern California Edison and our system operator, CAISO, about what previous results may have been, which might give them kind of a window into what they could expect in the technical studies. After which point the customer can either confirm their request or withdraw it. If they do confirm the request, then it moves into the technical studies phase. Here we have a phase 1 and a phase 2 study. So these include what the impact of that project is going to be on the system, both from a system reliability impact perspective, as well as a plan of interconnection. So getting into the details of, where are there positions available and in the substation, what's that plan going to look like, what those relays going to look like, and then do a endeavor to provide an estimated scope with cost duration for those upgrades. And then at each of those phases, phase 1 and phase 2, we do have a results meeting with the customer to discuss those results and make sure that they're clear on that and have an opportunity to ask any questions. After going through the study phase, we go to interconnection agreements. This is one of the most variable phases because some projects are just pushing forward ahead and we fly through this. Other times there can be suspensions, there can be delays, there can be other aspects of their. The goal of that stage, of course, is to have a signed interconnection agreement between the customer, Southern California Edison, and for the transmission projects, our system operator as well. Once we have that, then we would move ahead into project implementation. So this is where we actually execute the work on the Edison side to build the necessary upgrades to interconnect the project, including both network upgrades as well as interconnection facilities and potentially some distribution upgrades as well if those are needed for the project. Next, please. So a few of the traditional pain points that we've had early in the process. Sometimes it's working with the customer to get an accurate submission of their project. Sometimes they might have the wrong tariff. Sometimes our neighbors, the north and south, they have transmission at lower voltages. Southern California Edison, much of our 66 115 kV systems are actually distribution. So there's a little back and forth there. And then on the studies phase, the number one thing we hear is this is going to be too expensive. It's going to take too long, which does tend to result in a withdrawal of those projects. Over on the right here, I've shown, this is kind of just representative, but it sort of shows what the attrition that we typically see through the project phases. And we do typically see the highest rate of attrition following those the phase 1 study, as well as that phase 2 study. But this does sort of show how if we start with 100 applications, typically only 10 to 20 of those have historically come online into service. And not coincidentally, often those little stars, which represent the financial security postings, do tend to bring withdrawals with them as they're sort of the financial milestones along the study process. Another one that happens that's not explicitly called out here is the deliverability allocation. So projects are required to have deliverability to qualify for resource adequacy. So that would typically be known after the phase 2 technical study, which can also result in some projects withdrawing. Interconnection agreement, as I mentioned, highly variable. And then project implementation can also have delays. I think we're not the only ones in the industry. We hear this everywhere, but there have been a lot of supply chain delays. What used to be maybe a 20-week lead time item is now 100 weeks. So we are trying to find better ways to manage that, but it's definitely been a challenge, as well as skilled workforce, both in planners to complete the studies, as well as programming of remedial action schemes, which is a very specialized field and very difficult to train up on and find in the industry. And then also project issues around line routing, permitting the substation can definitely cause issues, cause rework, cause engineering delays as we try to figure out how to meet the customer best in their interconnection request. And also outages as well. Unfortunately, or for better or worse, there tend to be certain zones that are all very appealing. And when that happens, we often have to coordinate a lot of outages that sort of becomes an issue where once one project has a delay, it has domino effect and it hits everyone else down the aisle as they all need those previous projects to be able to come online. Next, please. So some recent interconnection trends, some of you may be familiar with this, but we've seen a big increase in these requests. So what I'm showing here is these are Edison affected systems studies, as well as our direct studies. So affected systems is where it might be on a neighboring system, but it could impact our system, so we study it. Looking at both the transmission and the wholesale distribution studies. We're kind of in the 40s to 100s range for about 10 years there. The QC indicates Q cluster. We do our studies in a cluster process. And then up until recent years, QC 14 was sort of this supercluster, and we were all, there's a lot of interest and noise around managing that 2 years ago. And then that got eclipsed by QC15 that more recently came, and again doubled QC14. And then as well, we also see a lot more batteries, which I think is encouraging for many of us, especially in California, as we start seeing that high system need peak in the early evening as the solar drops off. Whereas a couple of years ago, there were certainly battery projects, but nowadays, if you don't have some sort of energy storage on your project, you're in the distinct minority of project submittals. One thing that has been very consistent is we have not seen any developers that elect to finance the area upgrades that is considered as an option as part of the cluster, the phase 1 studies in that process. Also, in addition to number of applications, we have an increasing size of applications and overall application size. So for reference, again, this is very preliminary because of what I'll mention in a moment, but in QC15, we're looking at roughly 100,000 megawatts of new generation. Edison, our all-time system peaks about 25 gigawatts. So we're looking at 4 times that just in one cluster. So just huge numbers of project submittals. And then lastly, our average time from application to in-service is about 6 years for the transmission and a little less than 5 years for the distribution projects. Next, please. So there's been a lot of activity in this space, largely due to both the greatly increasing need as well as the greatly increasing number of applications to meet that need here in the state of California. So late last year, there was a memorandum of understanding signed between 3 of our key agencies, the California Public Utilities Commission, California Energy Commission, and the California Independent System Operator. Whereas historically there was a cycle, but it was a couple of years between going from integrated resource plan that becomes an input to the transmission planning process. Then that would those upgrades would then feed inputs into the integrated resource plan, but that would take like 2 years. And realizing that due to this rapid need, we had to have that tighter coordination. So that was an MOU that laid the groundwork for that. And it was also considered a factor in the CAISO approving a transmission plan quite recently with $7.3 billion of new transmission, the vast majority of that being focused on achieving our state resource goals and also aligning those resource goals to certain procurement zones with the goal of targeting the procurement into those zones. More recently, the CAISO has initiated an interconnection process enhancements that is designed to create transformative change in how we're currently doing our projects. Today, anyone that can pay the money and develop the model can submit an interconnection application request, and we do study it as part of these clusters. However, and I'll get this again in just a moment, it's getting increasingly difficult to have those studies be meaningful and useful as the numbers just skyrocket above any plausible load that we could see on our system. And due to those high number of interconnection requests and the need for this initiative, CAISO did file an application to pause the processing of those cluster 15 applications. Normally we'd be neck deep in it right now, but because of this initiative, we are instead focusing on improving our interconnection process as opposed to just digging the hole deeper based off of our old process. For us in Edison, we are trying very hard to improve on this. There's been a great increase in the amount of interconnection work we're looking for as well. So we are looking to hire new staff roles, do a better job of forecasting this work, better tracking, better dashboards, better procurement cycles. So we are working on this as well. But as the saying goes, it's going to take a village of all of us to work through these issues. Next, please.
About a minute and a half.
All right, thank you. This is my last slide, I promise. So I did want to speak a little bit more to those interconnection process enhancements as they reference the pain points that we have seen in our current cluster process. And a lot of work went into this at a workshop last week, so I didn't want to endanger paraphrasing it. And so you've got all the details here. But essentially looking at 2 problem statements with our interconnection process. One being around, essentially, we've overwhelmed our existing process. We look at integer multiples of our peak load. This results in upgrades that are just not practical and are going to take a very long time to build. We spend a lot of time trying to scope out these upgrades that we realistically don't see as being needed. But because of the cluster process, we spend this time, and then all of these projects, well, then now they have to look at this as they look at their studies and sort of account for that in any potential PPA negotiations, or as they look at the timing and the cost of their own project, which doesn't make it particularly valuable for them either. There's also a lot of interest in how can we get better information up front for these developers so that they don't have to go through this 18-month study cycle to get what they're looking for out of it. So right now there's a lot of activity in trying to work through this, and how can we get sort of a smaller number of better application requests up front. Then the other problem statement is around managing the queue. So we have many projects that have sort of languished in this existing process, and it's believed that they are sort of clogging up the ability for some of these newer, possibly more viable projects to enter into the queue and move forward to commercial operation. And so there is interest, again, at that broader stakeholder level to try and make sure that we're not standing in the way of new resources because of these older resources. So that's all for my section. Back to you, Alex.
Thanks, Allison. Really good presentation. Lots of really good information there for us all to see. So I'm just going to keep rolling right through. And up next, we have Evan Wilcox from AEP, who's going to give his perspective. So, Evan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Alex, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a different perspective here, coming from the transmission owner realm. For those of you not familiar, American Electric Power, we operate in across 11 states and 3 different RTOs. So, the interconnection process is a little different, and depending on which region you're in, challenges can be a little bit different depending on which system you're connecting to. But, by and large, it also provides us with a lot of experience, and we can, try to bridge some gaps and solve some problems because of, seeing best practices across different areas. So, where we sit as a transmission owner and operator is unique because, we are the first call when bad things happen and some, an end use customer loses their power. We're the first call. And if something happens in the system and a generator trips offline, we're the first call. And it's really the transmission owner's responsibility to provide that reliable service, irrespective of the type of load you're serving or the type of generation connected to your system. So that puts us in and that's the responsibility. But there's also things that are sort of outside of our control that we tend to have to deal with. And when it comes to inverter-based resources, we're learning as we go with the rapid expansion and finding some things out that we didn't really foresee, and so we're using that experience and I have to acknowledge the fact that NERC and other entities are working across several channels to address many of the things that I'll talk about. But there are some gaps in terms of like what we as the transmission owner can do, and versus what our responsibility is from a reliability perspective. So if we go to the next slide, Alex. So I'm going to probably use some terms that some of you may understand, some of them may be a little bit technical, but I'll explain. So for example, with inverter-based resources, the ability of that plant, that generation to stay online when there's disturbances on the system is really important, because then we can count on that resource being available, through a variety of different system conditions. So in the interconnection process, we model that in our studies, but what we're seeing, and there's been several NERC reports on this, is that the actual performance of the plant and and their ability to ride through these events in reality doesn't necessarily match what was studied and modeled in the interconnection process. So at the end of the day, whose responsibility is that? Is that, did we not do the study properly? Was the model incorrect? Is the generator, the settings at the plant or their system of an ability to ride through this? Is that, is it their problem? It's sort of a challenging thing to say, this is just your problem. It's something that affects multiple parties, and sometimes that can be challenging to work through. The second issue here is, again, a very technical issue, but certain types of specifically wind farms have, it also can have subsynchronous, SSO stands for subsynchronous oscillation, SSCI, subsynchronous control interaction, but basically these very complex machines and the wind farm and the series compensation that is placed on the lines, they can have an interaction, which can be bad for the plant in terms of actually damaging their equipment, but also can have issues with the operation of the transmission grid and that equipment as well. We have a situation now that we're working through where we're seeing some issues with an interaction of a nearby plant with a series capacitor. And the solution basically temporarily is to take that series capacitor out of service under normal operation. So it's one of these things where we're having to sort of reconfigure the grid based on an issue that really should have been addressed by the plant and should have been uncovered through the interconnection study, but for one reason or another it wasn't. So maybe it's modeling deficiency, whatever, but now, sort of whose problem is that? Is that the plant's problem, or is that the transmission operator's problem? And the third example here is when we have generation that's co-located with load, the expectation is that if you lose the transmission sources, that generation will also disconnect, so that you don't have this islanding situation where you may have generation and load by themselves, and we don't have necessarily the capability of operating in that situation. So it risks, we have to rely on, again, that plant to see that, hey, we've lost the source, we're going to disconnect. But and so if they don't, there's a risk that customer equipment could be damaged, etc. Again, what's who's responsible and what's the recourse there? There's not really a standard. There's not a requirement necessarily for performance. So we're sort of at risk that if a customer has damaged equipment, maybe it's because of this islanding situation, but as the transmission owner, as the utility, it could be our problem to deal with. So those are just a few examples, again, just very specific examples to kind of demonstrate some of the challenges. Move to the next slide. A few other examples, just some of the challenges that we deal with. So when we look at some of the event, what we talked about earlier with, the ride-through capability, we know there's solutions to that. One is doing a much more detailed level of analysis using much more detailed models that are available and are being evaluated right now as far as was this a requirement? I mean, they use this system called PSCAD to do these very detailed studies. The challenge there, though, is that those models aren't necessarily available and aren't required to be provided, at least at this time. Two, the level of time and expertise it takes to run those analysis can be significant. And so that, it kind of runs in the face of trying to speed up the interconnection process. This is actually extended, so that's a challenge. So, we think that this is something that needs to be addressed. This is the way that we'll be able to make sure that, these plants are going to be able to operate the way we think that they are. But is it really practical for us, every single plant that comes in to interconnect, to do this sort of detailed analysis? Probably not. So obviously there's some, industry work around this topic, but it's just one of those things, again, where, we're sort of caught in the middle in terms of what we think needs to be done, what can be done, and then, who ultimately is responsible for ensuring that. Move on to the next slide. Talking about enforcement. So we have, as the company transmission owner, we have interconnection requirements document. It's mainly there to guide, both load and generation customers in terms of like physical design, protection systems, those types of requirements. It's not really designed to be a performance criteria document. And right now, there's not really, there's not a standard that says, you as the generation customer need to abide by, a utility's interconnection requirements. So if we were to, have performance requirements in our document, there's no mechanism right there really for us to say, yes, you're in violation of these interconnection requirements. It's more of a, here's what we need to do to get you connected type of thing. So again, is there legal recourse? I mean, maybe, but no one wants to get into that realm. So it's not really an ideal place to address these things because of that nature. So again, it just it illustrates that we're all trying to sort of fill these gaps, but there are things that aren't really neat and clean that we can address. One thing that we do have in our documentation is, requirements on things like power quality for end-use customers, for example, but specifically with our end-use customer agreements, we have addendums that address, things like power quality. So those are between, the utility and the customer. They're not necessarily performance requirements that are, for everyone or specifically for generators and that kind of thing. So as try as we might, to get this stuff documented, the enforcement piece of it is a little bit challenging. I'll go to the next slide. This is another example of something. So we've got, the IEEE 2800 standards, which is, it addresses some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of like ride-through performance and some of these, the ability of the plants to stay online when bad things happen, that kind of thing. So it's a good standard. It addresses some of these things. It's necessary, but as an IEEE standard, it's a voluntary standard. It's not something that is, thou shalt must until there is a jurisdictional entity that can enforce it. So typically that would be, an RTO or even even the local utility or the state. Those kind of things. Those have to be adopted and put into those into that category. So we have the standard by an entity that's there to address these kind of technical issues. But it's not necessarily, required at this point. A couple of reasons why are one, not all of our states have adopted it as a standard, and so that creates a challenge for treating everyone consistently. But so it's being looked at as potentially becoming a sort of baseline for some of the requirements. But again, we're in the situation where we've got a lot of this generation connected. We have a lot that's trying to get online, and we're sort of trying to address it in retrospect as opposed to proactively. So again, I want to reinforce the fact that there's a lot of work going on around this topic to address these things, but we're sort of caught in the middle sometimes and not being able to have the authority necessarily as a transmission owner to address everything that happens out there. So the last slide I have is just sort of some concluding statements. Again, I just kind of mentioned that we're sort of building the airplane as it's flying kind of thing right now, and that does make it a little bit challenging. And some of the things that we're trying to address do require more analysis, more details, more specifics, and that sort of runs counter to the desire for speed when it comes to the interconnection process. So we're trying our best to sort of balance those things. One thing, a lot of things I've been talking about, when we talk about reliability now, it's much less in the steady state world. We're not necessarily looking at, oh, this line's going to be overloaded. It's really the dynamics around the very short time periods, which is just as important to the stability of the grid. But it's these very detailed nuances that each plant specifically can affect, and so it's complicated. Those studies take time. Some tools that we use aren't really designed for evaluating these types of things and doing it so in an efficient manner. So we need to do some work in terms of just making the process more efficient, making sure we're able to analyze the things we need to analyze to maintain reliability without being so cumbersome that we are not allowing that generation to connect. And then the final thing I just reinforce is we all work together, and I think that there's no clear defined roles and responsibilities sometimes. But as as the transmission owner, once we're clear of the interconnection process, it's our job to make sure we're operating the system reliably. But at the same time, we have to rely on our other jurisdictional entities to help us enforce the rules and make sure that that we know the system that we're operating and can fully trust everyone who's connected to it. So that's all I have for today, Alex. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Evan. Really good presentation. Very good points on the FAC 1 standard and the problems you all have with that. I think that's good to see and make note of here for everyone to look at. So really appreciate that presentation. And we're running maybe a minute behind, but Jay, you get your full 10 minutes just the same. So Jay's up next. He said he wants to go long to cut some Q&A out, but I'm not going to let him. So you got 10 minutes, Jay.
Well, thank you, Alex. I can talk really slow, but I have a tendency to speed up, so let me know I'm talking too fast. So I'm Jay Texera, Manager of Resource Integration at ERCOT. Next slide. So the ERCOT interconnection process is slightly different than definitely what we heard earlier in this presentation and a lot of the other parts of the country. We don't have a queue. Each project can move on its own. But due to the number of interconnections that we're getting, there are crunch points where it may seem like it's a queue because it kind of gets bunched up. One of the key aspects that ERCOT has is we do not guarantee deliverability. During the interconnection process, only the driveway is built, connecting the generator to the transmission system. The highway, improving the transmission system, is determined through the planning process. So the ERCOT system has been described as connect and manage, where we connect the generation and manage the congestion by congestion management during real-time operations. We do studies to ensure reliability with the connected generator at the spot of the interconnection, but we don't do studies during the interconnection process to build transmission. So the ERCOT process is 18 to 30 months for what we call larger generation, defined as greater than or equal to 10 megawatts, and 8 to 12 months for what we call small generation, less than 10 megawatts. And this is just the process. It doesn't include any construction or supply delays. Next slide. So the ERCOT interconnection process has 3 stages, historically stemming from 3 departments used to do each stage. In 2017, we put all of it into one department called Resource Integration. So we still keep kind of the 3 stages. The first stage is interconnection request application to the QSA, And then the second stage is registration and modeling. The third stage, energization, synchronization, and commissioning. So in the first stage, they have to submit an application and they pay their fees. The fees are $5,000 for anything less than or equal to 150 megawatts and $7,000 for greater than 150 megawatts. That's for the application. The application automatically starts a screening study, which is a transfer analysis. We just go from 0 to the max size of the project, model the unit at the POI and the interconnection in the transmission system, and see how much you can get out in first contingency analysis. So we give that information to the developer, and he decides whether to move forward. The next stage would be the full interconnection studies. This is where the transmission service providers in the ERCOT system that own the interconnection facilities. They will do a steady state, short circuit, dynamic, and facility studies, and they give that information to the developer. Now, the TSP also charges extra for these studies outside of what ERCOT charges. ERCOT charges $15 per megawatt for the FIS. They also have to do an application and pay the fees for the FIS. Now, sometimes they have to do a subsynchronous resonance study. They determine the need for it during the screening study, where the Dynamic Studies Department will do a screening to see if it's N-14 contingencies away from the series capacitor. And if it is, then it'll have to do the subsynchronous resonance study after the FIS. And that's usually contracted out or done by the TSP as well. They have to do what we call a standard generation interconnection agreement. And we have now a web application called RIO, Resource Integration and Ongoing Operations. They submit data for the full interconnect studies, about 80 pieces of data. And then later for the planning model, it's about 150 pieces of data. We also have to make sure they comply with our operational standards. One of which is they do a reactive study to make sure their design will meet our reactive requirements, 0.95 lead and lag at the point of interconnection. Next is the quarterly stability assessment, which I'll go into that a little bit more on the next slide. So stage 2, registration and modeling. Not next slide, go back to the previous slide. Stage 2, registration and modeling. The developer has to register as a resource entity, a market participant. Then they have to enter into RIO about 1,000 pieces of data in order to go into the network operations model, which is our master database of everything that is needed by any application needing a model in ERCOT. So that's planning information, settlement information, market information, and EMS information. Part of the information is a ERCOT full settlement meter for billing and the easy ID, so that any retail load at the gen site will go to the right service provider. And of course, also have to supply telemetry using ICCP so that we can see the data in the EMS. So stage 3, energization, synchronization, and commissioning. First, the TSP has to energize their facilities. So they usually end up building either a new bay, an existing station, or they have to build a new station and a transmission line. So those have to be energized. And then the developer has to submit a plan on how they plan to commission the resource. Then they have to go through new generator commissioning checklist, which has 3 parts. Part 1 is request to energize their facilities. So everything except the generator gets energized. So we can check some of the telemetry, we can set transformers and stuff like that. Part 2 is request for initial synchronization. This is where they start generating. And if they're a battery, where they start charging. So once they've got part 2 and they're cleared to go to their full size, they have to do some testing, curtailment testing, automatic voltage regulation testing, reactive testing, and primary frequency response testing. Once they've passed all those tests, they can then submit part 3, which is a request to commission the resource, and this is the exit out of the interconnection process. Okay, Alex, next slide. So quarterly stability assessment, this was started in 2018. This was the first attempt to get a number of units that are all synchronizing at the same time, or at least in the same quarter. See, in the first column, this is the quarter, January, February, March. So everybody that has a synchronization date, which allows them to start generating, they will all be in this one study for this quarter, the deadline of August 1, and the study will end at the end of October. Now, in order to make it in that deadline, they have to complete all the stuff at the bottom of the slide. They have to complete the requirements of Planning Guide Section 6.9, which allows them to go into the planning models. This consists of the IA, air water permits, notice to proceed, and money to fund the interconnection facilities the TSP has to build. This gets refunded after part 3. They have to complete the FIS studies, complete the reactive power study, system improvements and mitigation plans have to be identified, and they have to comply with all operational standards up to this point. Alex, next slide. So this is a timeline for an interconnection that wants to start with a screening study only. And there's never assumptions. The IE has to submit correct data, meet all the milestones, not change equipment, which is a big thing. And the TSP has no backlog, so usually TSP will have a backlog. So this is a 30-month timeline. They submit the application on the far left. Yeah, 3 months to do the screening study. And then the IE, or the developer, has 6 months to decide if they want to move forward to do the full interconnect study. Now, secondary timeline is they can start with the full interconnect study. So they can start on October 1, 2020 with a full interconnect study, in which case we don't do the screening study. We do the SSR screening, but not the screening study. The TSP then does the FIS, and it's a range, I think they can do it in 3 to 6 months normally, but sometimes more. I put 10 months into this timeline. So they do the FIS, they complete that, and during that time, the developer does a racking study. So after the FIS is complete, if they have to do the SSR study, then they do that after the FIS. They also have to provide notice to proceed and financial commitment prior to the QSA deadline. Then after the QSA, next thing is the production load date. This is when they go into the network operations model. They have to submit that data 90 to 120 days prior to the day they want to go into the model. And only once they're in the model can they start energization, synchronization, and doing their testing to get final commissioning. Next slide.
About a minute and a half, Jay.
Okay. All right, this is the timeline for small generation. This is anything that's less than 10 megawatts, whether it's connected to transmission or distribution. Normally they're connected to distribution, and normally they're batteries, but they don't have to be. So they first start off working with the TSP. The TSP will do whatever studies they think necessary, called system impact studies. They have to do an IA, and that's to determine if there's any operational limitations. Then once they finish that, they then submit their data to ERCOT, via RIO. ERCOT will then review all those submissions that they did with the TSP. And if those are good, then we'll allow the developer to submit their resource data. We'll review that, and then they go into that 90 to 120 day period prior to the production load date. They go in the model, and then they do the part 1, 2, and 3, just like large generations does. All right, next slide, Alex. So this is some of the trends we've been seeing. The blue lines and the blue columns are the count of the applications coming in. So this is the left side of the timeline where they submit applications. It has been steadily going up since 2018, one exception, 2020. Pandemic slowed it down a little bit. We came back with a vengeance the next year and the following year. And this year we're in line to do another record. FIS applications are also going up. Yes. And you can see down here the cluster of the red, blue, purple, and red. Those are the commissionings, part 1, 2, and 3. Those average roughly about 10 to 15% of the applications. And they're also, of course, reflecting applications that came in a couple of years earlier. The next slide. So again, application megawatts, this is showing it by fuel. We have coal, gas, and nuclear. The coal and the nuclear are all what we call repowers, where they're replacing equipment. And we did get 10,800 megawatts of gas applications during that period. And then on the other category, which is moving to the right, those are where the batteries would be. And now about 2 of these applications are batteries. And you can see that number is skyrocketing. The next to that is solar, been pretty high, coming down a little bit. Wind is on its descent, and it is still descending. Next slide. Now, these are the commission megawatts. These are the ones that actually get into service and finish the interconnection process. So, gas, we had some spikes, 987 megawatts in that 1 year. I think it's 2022. And nuclear, again, coal, those were all repowers. And the other batteries are starting to come up and come into service. The solar is starting to come back into service. We had 2 projects equal to 974 megawatts. And then for wind, you know, they're at the tail end of their timeline, so they're starting to come into service. Okay, I think that's the last slide, Alex.
Thanks, Jay. Very good presentation. Let's get all the panelists back on video and unmuted, and we'll get right into the Q&A here. There we go. All right, I'm just going to jump right into it with the fun one at the beginning. So if each of you, right, if y'all could, if you wanted to or could advocate for one must-do thing. So, you know, one thing that you have to do in the industry to address the challenges we talked about today. You know, what critical message would you say, or would you want to give to the industry with this, you know, the platform here? Just kind of in 1 or 2 or 3 sentences, just kind of like a perfect utopia. What would the best thing must do be to help mitigate these challenges?
Well, I guess I can start. I would say that, you know, the important thing is the models. The models have, you know, 10 years ago when wind started coming in, the models were not very good. And we keep increasing to get better models, but we keep demanding more from our models. So we had an instance in ERCOT where in real time, we had a fault and some generation tripped off. And according to the models, they should not have tripped. So the models are very important. We need to get really good models.
Thanks, Jay.
Jay kind of stole my thunder there. I was going to say something very similar. You know, if every generator that comes in has a really good model and has all the information that we need to do the studies up front, this process can work very efficiently. A lot of times when we get hung up in the process, it's when we're going back and forth trying to find, you know, again, sometimes very technical information. But if everyone sort of, you know, gets on board with, you know, here's exactly what we need, here's the quality it needs to be, I think things will improve. So yeah, definitely the modeling aspect, I think, is probably tops on my list as well.
I think so.
Yeah, not to be unoriginal, I do think models are the key for us as well, with a slight twist there, which is around if we can focus on like, you know, I heard from Jay too, like they're looking at 10 to 15% of their interconnection requests turn to projects. So if we can focus on fewer projects, then we can spend more time working on those models and understanding more of them. If we just have too many models, no matter how good those models are, it's still very difficult to get accurate results in our studies. So just kind of pancakes the challenge on top of each other to have too many of, you know, the modeling issues as well.
Thank you. And I guess slightly related or follows on to that question. You know, you all are receiving the data from the generator owners for their facilities. You know, the dynamic and steady state models. So what mechanisms do y'all have in place to kind of review that data or mitigating discrepancies? And what happens if you find out, you know, some of your studies got performed with maybe you know, out of date or incorrect data? Like, what kind of mechanisms are there for you know, review and mitigation of data issues?
Yeah, for us, I mean, early on, we pretty much have to take the developers that submit the models at their word. So we run some kind of sanity checks on them, but ultimately they're the GO. They're responsible for the models. So really, it's not until commissioning and we go out there, do set voltage tests, try to look and see if we can verify the performance of the model against the performance of the generator. That's really kind of our opportunity to catch it and see if there's any other implications for that.
I think from our
go ahead, Evan. Sorry.
I was going to say, I think, yeah, from our perspective, you know, it's not a really clean process. You know, there's a lot of back and forth between us and the developer, and then really the developer and then the OEM, right, the manufacturer of the equipment. But yeah, I mean, we know the types of information that we need. You know, we try to be as clear as possible, and you know, again, run some sort of tests to kind of make sure it works, you know, before we get too far into the analysis piece of it. So But yeah, it's a it can be a challenge. Just a lot of it depends on the expertise that's on the other side. If that's a very experienced developer that's done this before, it can be very smooth. If it's somebody who's new to the game a little bit, it can be a little more of a challenge. So.
Yeah, I agree. When we get people that ask questions like, "How do I start the interconnection process?" That's where you just kind of cringe a little bit and throw some documents at them. So yeah, the more experienced developers are much better to work with.
Okay. Thanks. It sounds like we heard it from in pretty much all of the sessions that the industry itself needs a little bit more collaboration. Hopefully that can help get those geos as much experience as possible, and same with the OEMs, and I guess same with the folks, right? The utility folks. Everyone working together is going to help everyone kind of manage these processes. A little follow-up question, follow-up question to Allison's response. Sorry to pick on you, but it sounds like the first big real check happens at commissioning. What happens, I guess, if there's a discrepancy, during the commissioning check? Like, do you kick them back to the beginning of the process, or is there like a separate channel for mitigating those?
Yeah, so when we see discrepancies, it does depend. There are some times where maybe there was a setting, and it does help the customer to find that the setting was wrong, or there's a meter connected the wrong way, or something along those lines. Because we sort of see the commissioning test is both the developer validating that they're getting what they mean, as well as us validating the model that they gave us is what they actually built. But there are times when they do take a look at that and have to come back and submit an updated model. And we do look at that when that happens. Obviously update our records, check if there's any other concerns that show up as a result of that. But it does not kind of institute a formalized process at this point about how that happened or what needs to occur as a result of that discrepancy.
Thanks, Allison. And Jay, maybe I'll pick on you next, since ERCOT has the checklist, right? The commissioning checklist. So I guess same question to you. When you notice discrepancies in the performance and things like that, what's ERCOT's process for resolving those?
Well, we just don't pass them because they have to pass in order to get through the commissioning process. But unfortunately, they're already generating. So for many developers, they're generating, they're making money, they're happy. They may not be motivated to actually do whatever they need to do to pass the test. And so we started looking at that. And we recently have submitted some revision requests to our rules to put time limits on the amount of time it can take before they don't meet it in that time period. Then we'll pass them on to compliance and then to the next level.
Cool, thank you. And then I guess this is a third follow-up question, because this is a good line of questions. When you do these comparisons and you see a discrepancy, which is the baseline, right? Is it the model that was used in the interconnection process, or is it what's already on site? Like, when you mitigate the discrepancies, are you changing the site to match what you studied, or vice versa? And that was for everybody. Whoever wants to answer. It's a hard one.
Yeah, like I think we see both cases. We do sometimes see cases where the actual behavior wasn't what they were looking for. And so as a result, there were some changes to the model, like maybe there was a parameter that was set incorrectly, caused some oscillations, or an unintentional delay there. I would say probably it's more common that the model gets adjusted to the actual behavior, but I do think field commissioning is very helpful at identifying field issues as well.
Thanks. And then, sorry, direct follow-up. When you change the model, do you rerun any interconnection studies as like a sanity check, or does it just get captured in the performance of the next planning cycle?
I know we look at it to some extent. I don't know exactly how comprehensive, but then it certainly does go into our future reliability studies at absolute minimum.
Okay, thank you. Very good. Jay, sorry, I cut you off, Jay.
That's okay. So I was going to say that, if the model shows like no problems, but when they go online, they start generating we see oscillations or something like that, then we'll resend their permission to generate, resend their part 2, and or lower them down to a much lower megawatt level until they get it resolved.
Yeah. That's a pretty good incentive, I think, to resolve it, right? Yeah, you don't make any money until you fix the problem. Okay. Evan, anything from your perspective on any of those questions, or anything to add to anyone else's answers, or before we move on to the next one?
Yeah, I think, from where we sit, the kind of interesting thing there is, right, is how much can you do ahead of the interconnection versus after, so some of these issues we resolve, after they're connected, and that may be the only feasible way to do it, really, because we can't try to, 100% certainty on everything, before a plant goes online. So I think this is probably one of those areas that will require some development is, what kind of analysis do we need to do from a system perspective, maybe not generator by generator, but from a system perspective, to sort of catch, potential issues, after the generators are connected, but not necessarily part of the interconnection process. So it's kind of one of those things that, I think that there's probably some things that can be done study-wise, and just in general to, again, just try to catch, potential issues before they become a problem. Right now, I think we tend to catch things after an event happens, and, so somehow getting ahead of that is probably an area where we got to work on.
Thank you. So this last one will be kind of a lightning round question. We only got a couple of minutes left, but I guess what's your feeling, you all's feeling on the biggest challenge in the interconnection process right now, and how would you address it? Not models. We already said models, but aside from models, the biggest challenge y'all have managing the process.
Right now, our biggest problem is having too many.
Good. Any thoughts on mitigating that, or probably it's a really hard one?
Well, we got to try to get more people, and we're trying to get more people, but it's a hard market right now.
Yeah.
Hard market.
Thanks, Jay.
I think the challenge can be a little bit different by region. In areas where the generator is responsible for cost, a lot of times you've got to really pinpoint exactly what issues that specific generator is causing, because then they have to pay for upgrades and things like that. So that's a challenge with the process in general. But I think it's just the volume for sure is probably the biggest challenge, and just trying to be as efficient as possible with the process, but still being comfortable that we've done enough analysis, I think, is probably the biggest challenge.
Thank you.
No, I agree with both of those. I think for us, it's both the number and also with that the uncertainty, where again, it becomes very difficult when we never know which projects are going to actually appear where. It gets very difficult to really plan for the future of the system with that much uncertainty in the process. So, but the numbers and the uncertainty behind them.
Yep. Great answers. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. That's the end of the panel session. Thanks for answering all the questions and taking the time to present to us today. It's a really great series of presentations and a lot of good information for everyone. So with that, we're taking off next week, like I mentioned before, for the holiday week. And then we're doing 3 starting July 11th, 12th, and 13th. Will be our final 3. We're doing 3 in 1 week just to avoid conflict with the IEEE PES general meeting. But in 2 weeks' time, we're going to have a session on commissioning. We'll have a session from NERC and CERC on IBR registration and reliability standards enhancements. And then the last webinar 11, is just going to be folks from NERC presenting on our risk mitigation strategy for IBRs, things we've, key takeaways and highlights that we want to make sure we really promote during that we saw during the webinar series, and then just a recap of what we're seeing and what we're going to do moving forward with all this information we all are learning from this webinar series. So I guess with that, thanks everyone, and we will see you hopefully in about 2 weeks.
All right.